So, what we're going to be doing next is going to be a basic summary of Lacan's three registers of subjectivity. So, that would be the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real. We're going to start off by talking about these registers in phenomenological terms. What that means, at least for the intuition I want to work with, is that what I mean by phenomenology, I mean as an approach that doesn't concern itself necessarily with just experience itself, but the conditions for the possibility of experience. Now, last time I mentioned that we would start on these terms, but we'll find that as we move along the way, we're going to be exceeding those terms we're starting with. We're going to be looking at the limits of these conditions or something that's besides them. So, in order to do this, we're also going to have a discussion about metaphor and how is it that it plays a role in psychoanalysis. And lastly, we're going to be looking at a case that Slavoj Žižek has referred to as woman as a symptom of man. So, building our way there, we're going to do just a reading that takes on some of the ideas in Lorenzo Chiesa's Subjectivity and Otherness. It is a book that is doing a similar approach to what we're doing insofar as we're looking at dividing Lacan's work into three periods, each surrounding a particular register of the structures of Lacanian subjectivity. So as a supplement on the video, I have provided a schema L, which is going to be one of the structures we're going to be looking at. A schema L comes from Lacan's seminar on the Purloined Letter, which is a story by Edgar Allan Poe, and he does a reading essentially dealing with the structure of the text. This schema will help us as a point of reference for this discussion. But before starting here, I want to have a brief word on Lacan's notion of metaphor. So I will also provide the picture for the structure metaphor, and I'll try to provide a reading of it, building us up to other forms of structure that we'll encounter in Lacan. So metaphor in the psychoanalytic experience is that in the relationship of speech, the psychoanalysand is at knots over what they mean in talking to the analyst, between what can be spoken out, which in the picture will be S1, and in the act of speaking, which should be the $sign. In other words, what this is trying to formalize is the notion that the subject of psychoanalysis is split between what it can say about itself and what it fails to say. Because what is explicitly spoken out can obscure what is happening in the act of speaking. For instance, if Lacan were to stage Descartes, he wouldn't say, I think, therefore I am. Instead, he would say something along the lines that, I think where I am not, therefore I am where I do not think. I am not whenever I am the plaything of my thought. I think of what I am where I do not think to think. So we're going to start by looking at the early Lacan, which is often characterized by the mirror stage and the imaginary register. In schema L, if we turn to it, this is noticed as the relationship between an ego and another, which in the schema is formalized as the relationship between the A and the A with apostrophe on it. In a word, this relationship between an ego and its object, as in the phrase I want this, supposes the phenomenological insight that consciousness is apparently transparent to itself. At least to it seems clear that it wants this. I've used the example, I want pizza, and asking the question, why? Why do you want that thing? Well, I want pizza. In some sense, this sort of expression captivates the I want this behind this. I don't need to go much further than that. It is apparently transparent to this consciousness, as it is in relationship to itself, that this is its truth, that the appearance is the thing itself in a sense. But in middle Lacan, he introduces the big other, which we discussed to some extent. This is also known through the notion of the symbolic. This is noted in schema L as the big A, which is also reflected by the parenthesis of the big other. Whereas in early Lacan, he pertains himself with a consciousness that is apparently transparent to itself. Here, consciousness is apparent to itself only through an other. For instance, the symbolic is effectively at work in the formation of an ego and its object, as desire articulates itself under the condition of a given language, or a culture that makes its sense of self intelligible, or a religion and belief system through which the ego gains worldly orientations, or ideology which structures desire as a political factor. The later Lacan is characterized through the real and a phrase that we have kind of mentioned before. There's no sexual relationship, where we come to terms that because consciousness is apparent to itself only through another, consciousness is not transparent to itself. Schema L notes this as the S, which is Freud's phrase that he used for the id, which in Lacan we have mentioned he translates as the French ça, which I had chosen to refer as this it. However, the real does not mean that the imaginary and the symbolic are nulled as a result of it speaking. Arriving at truth took semblance, obscuration, and forgetting. The tension of the real is only possible insofar as the imaginary and the symbolic are also in operation. So let us consider the example of woman as a symptom of man. Within the strictly imaginary register that we've spoken about, we observe the constitution of identity through the complementary identical sense of otherness. Woman is the symptom of man's fantasy insofar as his identity is contingent on the stability of woman as its object of desire. In the imaginary, we observe the constitution of identity through a seesaw of desire between attachments and detachments, as in the case of the crisis of masculinity, with the emergent case of radical gender movements, we can say that in a sense woman's stability as a general idea has been compromised, and therefore man has lost the sort of confidence and grounding stability in his notion of identity, insofar as its fantasy is grounded in this mirroring activity, you could say. Thus, the imaginary is contingent on the consistency and stability of its object around which it gains articulation. In the imaginary, self-narrative acts as a form of patching over inconsistencies, as this sensor function that attempts to reify its object to mold it within intelligible terms containing any exceeding excesses. For middle Lacan, the question of woman as a symptom of woman does not so much focus on the seesaw of desire between an ego and the object of desire. Rather, it is the structure that grants meaning to the whole movement, which is put under consideration this time. Whereas before we are looking at man and woman in the constitution of identity, what the crisis of masculinity never highlights is the general structure in which the seesaw of desire gain meaning. In other words, the crisis of masculinity highlights that there is a whole that breaks the consistency of identity and its constitutive object. And this structure that grants a meaning as intelligible and consistent is that of the symbolic vague other, whom we desire in accordance to its intelligibility. Whether we're wondering what is it that the social wants from us, what is it that mom wants from us, dad, any sort of figure that we're trying to figure out what they want from us, that their desire upon which we're trying to desire in accordance with. Of course, In accordance to the question of the injunctive demands surrounding how the vague other may desire, we may ask which other we are talking about. And when we ask ourselves which other we are talking about, this question generally has to be supposed in the sense in which we also construe that other. We put ourselves in that position in just generally wondering what the other wants. And this position in turn gets reflected back to us. So when we construe the vague other, we are also understanding how is it that we construe meaning, intelligible meaning in which we regulate desire. And lastly, in later Lacan, the question is not so much about the symbolic structure that tries to patch meaning as intelligible and consistent, but rather about the gap and hole in meaning that opens up when we face the unintelligible and the inconsistent. In the case of woman as a symptom of man's fantasy, the question is more so along the lines of the breakdown of meaning and symbolization due to its contingent ground. For as man's identity was contingent on woman, the moment woman ceased to be a stable and fixed guarantor of man, man broke down into an uncanny stranger to himself, once again reminding us that identity fails to be identical with itself. So next time, I want to look into Lacan's notion of topology. How is it that he takes this aspect of mathematics as a way of articulating his notion of the subject? At first, we'll see that by being able to talk about metaphor and actually using pictures and graphs for once, thank God for technological capabilities improving a little bit, we'll be able to have this discussion. And what I want to try to do then is try to highlight some various aspects about how Lacan moves from just a metaphoric use of structure to the structure being the subject itself. So we're gonna learn something that twists this whole thing we've been talking about narrative, and how is it that the narrative in one way or another still bears upon the thing itself we're talking about.